During the late 90s, it felt like Square could do no wrong. After the breakout success of Final Fantasy VII, the once niche company had become one of the biggest names in the industry. Throughout the PlayStation era, Square fired on all cylinders, continuing to release unique experimental titles like Brave Fencer Musashi, Bushido Blade, and Parasite Eve. Thanks to the goodwill earned by FF7, those games found plenty of success in their own right. But arguably, no PlayStation-era Square title was more anticipated than Final Fantasy VIII. As the direct follow-up to one of the generation's most influential games, that isn't surprising. Every preview and trailer made FF8 look like one of the most impressive games ever released. Its breathtaking pre-rendered environments embraced a grounded modern sci-fi aesthetic, while the series finally abandoned its big-headed character sprites and squashed character models in favor of realistically proportioned characters tailor-made for a more dramatic story. And of course, the CG cutscenes that helped define FF7 were back, bigger and more spectacular than ever. By all accounts, Final Fantasy VIII had the makings of a masterpiece. Upon release, it was an enormous success. Reviews were glowing, and the game shattered sales records, selling more than 2 million copies in Japan on its very first day, a new all-time record. By the end of the year, it had surpassed 6 million copies worldwide, making it the fastest-selling Final Fantasy, a distinction it would hold for 10 years. Within the fandom, however, FF8 quickly earned a reputation as the series' black sheep, arguably surpassing even FF2 as the franchise's most unconventional mainline entry. It became one of the most divisive games in the series, a reputation it still carries today. In many ways, that polarization has become its defining legacy, and it's exactly what makes the game so fascinating to revisit. Final Fantasy VIII was a game I struggled to gel with for years, and I'm far from alone. In a remarkably bold move, Square attempted to reinvent many of the JRPG conventions that had become standard over the previous decade. Nearly every familiar RPG mechanic was questioned, reinvented, or discarded entirely. Money isn't earned from battles, but through a recurring salary based on your seed rank, with extra income coming only from selling excess items. Weapons aren't purchased, they're crafted from money and specific materials. MP doesn't exist, with magic instead being stocked and consumed like standard items. Characters still gain EXP and level up, so there's no FF2 style shenanigans here, but enemies now scale to your party's average level. And those last two mechanics in particular became major sticking points for new players. Your primary method of acquiring magic is a battle command called Draw, which pulls anywhere from 1 to 9 copies of a spell from an enemy into that character's stock. Since enemies grow stronger alongside you, leveling up isn't actually what makes your party more powerful. Instead, higher-level enemies simply provide access to better spells, and usually better item drops as well. So, if leveling isn't your primary source of progression, what is? The answer is the junction system, which is inseparable from how magic works. Characters don't equip armor at all. Instead, spells are assigned directly to individual stats, boosting them by varying amounts depending on both the spell itself and the quantity you have stocked. Cure and life magic dramatically increase HP and vitality, for example, while offensive spells are better suited to strength or magic. You can also junction spells directly to your weapon, adding elemental or status effects to every attack, while defensive junctions grant resistance or even immunity to those same elements and status ailments. The other half of this system revolves around the game's summons, known here as Guardian Forces, or GFs for short. Much like Materia in FF7 acted as a stand-in for the job system, Guardian Forces fill that role here. Equipping a GF determines not only which stats a character can junction, but also which commands and abilities they can use in battle. Even basic default commands like magic and item must be assigned via GFs first. As enemies award ability points, GFs gradually learn new abilities, and the player can decide which ones to prioritize, allowing for a surprising amount of customization. The result is a progression system where your strength has very little to do with your level and almost everything to do with how effectively you've built your characters. Drawing magic from every new enemy and boss becomes essential, both because many bosses possess new GFs you can grab, and because the more copies of a spell you stock, the stronger its junction bonus becomes. In other words, the more magic you collect, the stronger your characters get. Enemy levels simply determine which spells become available, feeding back into the junction system rather than serving as progression on their own. From that description alone, you can probably tell that Final Fantasy VIII was one of the most inventive RPGs of its generation. But with that creativity came plenty of controversy. Some players simply refuse to engage with junctioning, despite the game's repeated tutorials, and frankly, that's on them. Other players had more understandable complaints. Early on, your junction options are extremely limited, and because casting magic could potentially lower the strength of your associated junctions, many players became reluctant to use magic at all. Instead, they leaned heavily on Guardian Forces, whose repeated lengthy summon animations quickly turned battles into a slog. Drawing also became a common source of frustration. Because it's your primary source of stat growth, neglecting it means falling behind. But early in the game, your magic stat is so low that you'll often draw only 2 or 3 spells at a time. Repeating that process over and over can get tedious in a hurry. Worse still, if frustrated players fell back on traditional RPG habits like grinding levels, that often made things even harder. Enemies scale alongside you, and if you're not properly engaging with the junction system, their stats increase much faster than yours. Once your Guardian Forces learn their first junction abilities though, and as long as one party member stays dedicated to drawing during each battle, the whole system does start to click. You naturally accumulate spells while fighting, enemies gradually unlock stronger magic as you level, and before long you're constantly improving your characters simply by playing normally. It's an incredibly satisfying progression system once it finds its footing, provided you're patient enough to reach that point. And I think that's where most people's frustrations actually come from. The problem isn't that junctioning is overly complicated, it's that the game never really explains how all of the systems connect. The biggest offender here is refining. Refining allows you to convert all of those seemingly useless item drops into spells using special abilities learned by your Guardian Forces. If you know what you're doing, it's possible to obtain mid and even high-tier magic in the game's starting area, turning your opening party into absolute powerhouses before the story has barely begun. The refining mechanic itself is perfectly intuitive. Every refine ability is clearly labeled, and the game explicitly tells you what each item becomes. The problem is that it just isn't signposted very well. GFs don't learn their refine abilities by default. You have to manually prioritize them, and once they are unlocked, they're tucked away behind a sub-menu. It's entirely possible to play for dozens of hours without realizing one of the game's most useful mechanics even exists. And that's frustrating because the fix here would have been so simple. One short conversation with a party member. Hell, just one single text box pop up. Just anything to let players know that this even exists. For crying out loud, I'm pretty sure the game spends more time explaining its optional card game than one of its core progression systems. For veteran RPG players, a lot of this was easy enough to piece together, but in 1999, many Western players' only real experience with the genre before Final Fantasy VIII was, well, Final Fantasy VII. FF8 brazenly subverted RPG conventions because it assumed that players already understood those conventions in the first place. For experienced fans, that made it one of the easiest Final Fantasy games to completely break. For newcomers, though, it could feel actively hostile, punishing the very habits that other RPGs had taught them. Grinding had always been the universal solution, even in Final Fantasy VII. Here, grinding often just made things worse, and that was by design. And therein lies the problem. For their highly anticipated follow-up to one of the most influential games ever made, Square created an RPG for advanced RPG players, seemingly forgetting, or simply not caring, that much of their audience had just discovered the genre like a year ago. In trying to make an RPG that felt intuitive by eliminating the need for grinding, they ended up creating an RPG that was, almost by definition, unintuitive. The systems are elegant once they click, but someone's gonna have to explain them to you first. I honestly don't think a lot of people would have the patience for a game like this if it came out today. I've beaten FF8 twice before, and even I didn't really find my groove during this playthrough until the beginning of Disc 2. That's roughly 10 hours in. Can you imagine many people today who would be willing to put up with a game for that long if they weren't enjoying it right away? I mean, like, what's Steam's refund window again? Like 3 hours? When I started replaying Final Fantasy VIII for this video, I realized it's actually my least played Final Fantasy. Not counting the MMOs, I've beaten every mainline game up through 12 multiple times, along with Tactics and 10-2 for good measure. FF8 though, I've only finished twice. Hell, I've even played FF2 more, a game I've gone on record saying is my least favorite in the series. And I think I know why that is. As much as I'm willing to defend FF8, as much as I admire how boldly it reinvented RPG conventions, and as much as I genuinely love its junction system, this game has always been kind of intimidating. It feels almost insurmountable without outside information. Not for the story progression, mind you, the main objectives are perfectly straightforward to follow, but for everything surrounding the game's finer mechanics, You're gonna need a guide. FF8 is the kind of game where you'll eventually end up with lists, charts, spreadsheets, or half a dozen browser tabs open just to keep track of everything. No matter how well you understand junctioning and refining, there is inevitably going to be information that you have to look up. Which enemies carry the spells you need? Which items refine into what? Where do you find those items? Which NPCs have the best triple triad cards? Simple. You look it up. Unless you're willing to spend dozens of hours cataloging every enemy, every drop table, every refinement recipe, and every card player by yourself, you're never going to discover all this stuff organically, much less memorize it. More than almost any other Final Fantasy other than probably X-2, FF8 feels like it was designed to sell strategy guides. And considering the state of the gaming industry at that time, that probably isn't far from the truth. Despite what a lot of modern players will sometimes say, pre-internet video games actually didn't expect you to figure everything out on your own. These games shipped with thick instruction manuals that were full of gameplay tips. The original Legend of Zelda included an overworld map right in the box. The original Final Fantasy came with a walkthrough covering nearly 2/3 of the game. Nintendo even operated a paid phone hotline dedicated just to helping players. Well into the PlayStation era, FF7 and 8 still included mini walkthroughs to guide players through their opening areas. Once strategy guides became a booming business in the early 90s, developers quickly realized that they were another possible revenue stream, particularly in Japan, where companies often published their own strategy guides in-house. Nintendo, Capcom, Bandai, Square was no different. They regularly wrote and released official Final Fantasy guides alongside the games themselves. And for players, the more elaborate the game's mechanics, the more obscure its secrets, the more tempting that strategy guide became. At a certain point, game development and guide development practically went hand in hand. They'd already convinced you to spend $60 on the game, why not squeeze another 30 out of you while they were at it?
You know, they make it so you can't defeat Zerg unless you buy this book. It's extortion, that's what it is.
So, no, I really don't think that all of FF8's obfuscated mechanics are completely accidental. Games from that era were often intentionally opaque because publishers expected players to buy the accompanying guidebook. Seriously, did anyone actually find Doom Train using nothing but the in-game hints? And if you did, how long did that take you to figure out? In many cases, developers weren't expecting you to just figure it out. They expected you to buy the strategy guide. And to me, FF8 is one of the clearest examples of that philosophy. I genuinely can't imagine the average player uncovering even half of this game's systems without any outside help. But man, once this game does finally click, it is phenomenal. Once you understand how all of its systems feed into one another and all the possibilities that are open to you, FF8 becomes one of the most satisfying games in the series. To put it mildly, this is probably the most exploitable Final Fantasy ever made. With just a little bit of planning, you can create absurdly powerful builds within just an hour of starting the game. And unlike many RPG exploits, this actually feels intentional. Outside of weapons, nearly every progression system eventually feeds back into junctioning, whether it's enemy drops, refining, or even the game's optional card game. Rather than following FF7's approach of scattering mandatory minigames throughout the story, FF8 features a single, fully developed minigame that's completely optional, Triple Triad. You're never forced to play it, and every reward it offers can technically be obtained elsewhere, but it's absolutely worth your time because it lets you strengthen your party far earlier than the main progression would normally allow. Just as items can be refined into spells, Triple Triad cards can be refined into rare items, which can then be refined into even more powerful magic. Right from Balam Garden, you can win mid-tier cards from various NPCs, and after earning just a few ability points by fighting fish on the nearby beaches, your first Guardian Force can learn Card and Card Mod. One turns weakened enemies into cards, while the other refines those cards into items. Using this method, you can obtain high-level magic before even reaching the game's first boss, pushing your stats to absurd levels. If you really know what you're doing, you can even collect the materials for Squall's ultimate weapon before the end of Disc 1. And the beauty of it is that none of this is required. You can absolutely break FF8 over your knee if you want to, but you can also just play normally, casually drawing magic, refining the occasional item, and letting enemies gradually unlock stronger spells as they level alongside you. What initially seems complicated, even convoluted, reveals itself to be an impressively interconnected system where nearly every mechanic supports each other. However you choose to play, FF8 gives you the tools to make it work with a little experimentation and patience. Battles in FF8 play very similarly to earlier games in the series, albeit with a few adjustments to support its unique mechanics. Combat still uses the familiar active time battle system, with characters acting in semi-real time based on their speed stat. The interface has also been cleaned up considerably, reducing menu clutter and giving you a much better view of the battlefield. You can even hide the UI entirely by holding select. The biggest change is how magic works. Since MP no longer exists, every spell consumes one copy from your stocked inventory instead. Basic spells can no longer target multiple enemies at once either, encouraging the use of spells like double and triple, or simply relying on summons for large-scale damage. Summons themselves have also changed. Rather than casting immediately, each GF must first charge before appearing. During that time, the summoning character's HP is temporarily replaced by the GF's own HP. If the Guardian Force is defeated before it finishes charging, the summon fails and must be revived afterward. Fortunately, each GF's charge time gradually decreases as its compatibility with that character improves through repeated use. Battles also introduce a timed hit mechanic, reminiscent of Super Mario RPG. Squall's signature Gunblade is exactly what it sounds like, and pressing R1 at the precise moment his attack connects will fire the weapon, increasing the damage dealt. It's essentially a manually executed critical hit, adding a welcome layer of player input beyond simply choosing commands. The same mechanic also carries over into Squall's limit breaks, rewarding precise timing with even more damage. Limit breaks themselves return from FF7, this time combining the idea with FF6's hidden desperation attacks. Whenever a character's HP becomes critically low, they have a chance to enter a sort of crisis mode and unleash their unique limit break. Every character's limit works differently. Squall expands on the Gunblade's trigger mechanic, Zell uses command inputs reminiscent of Sabin's blitzes, Irvine fires specialized ammunition, and Quistis serves as the party's blue mage, learning enemy abilities throughout the game. Selphie's limit randomly selects both a spell and number of casts, though persistent re-rolling can uncover unique abilities like Full Cure or Rapture. Rinoa is the only character with two entirely different limits. Angelo canon featuring her loyal dog Angelo, and Angel Wing, which causes her to automatically cast powerful spells without consuming any stocked magic. Because Crisis Mode can activate whenever a character is at low health, FF8 also gives players another opportunity to exploit its systems. Deliberately leaving your party at near death is risky, sure, but it dramatically increases your access to limit breaks, allowing skilled players to overwhelm difficult bosses. Later on, the Aura spell removes that risk by forcing Crisis Mode even when the party remains at full health. The battles themselves are just as enjoyable as any other Final Fantasy, but they're not without flaws. The far more detailed environments and character models make combat noticeably choppier than FF7's, despite both games technically running at the same frame rate. The cinematic camera work was also scaled back, likely to keep performance stable. Animations became longer across the board, even just the basic attacks. And because the ATB gauges completely pause whenever an action is playing out, battles can feel surprisingly sluggish. The result is easily the slowest battle system the series has seen to this point. Looking at the progression from FF6 to 7 to 8, you can almost watch Square's priorities changing in real time. Each game became increasingly focused on cinematic presentation, even if it meant sacrificing some of the snappy responsiveness that had made the earlier entries so satisfying to play. When it comes to pacing, FF8 is kind of all over the place. The game starts incredibly strong. In fact, I'd argue Disc 1 is some of the best material the franchise has ever produced. In terms of storytelling and pacing, I honestly don't think there's a single thing I'd change. Disc 2 remains strong as well, with one major exception I'll get to in a bit, but once Disc 3 begins, the wheels start to come off. The storytelling, world-building, pacing, and overall progression all lose momentum, and they don't really recover until you're right at the finale. Over the years, we've learned a lot more about how Square operated during this period, and the more behind-the-scenes information that has surfaced, the clearer it's become that FF8 lost a substantial amount of planned content during development. The first two discs do an admirable job holding everything together, but Disc 3 is where the rushed production really begins to show. During Square's so-called Golden Age, Hironobu Sakaguchi was overseeing the creative direction of virtually every major project in the company. During this era, Sakaguchi reportedly insisted that projects stay within an 18-month development cycle. For the time, that wasn't entirely unreasonable. It kept teams focused and prevented games being constantly delayed by endless iteration and second-guessing. But it also meant ambitious projects were often forced to leave ideas on the cutting room floor. The most infamous example of this was probably Xenogears, whose second disc is perhaps best described as the video game equivalent of the last two episodes of Evangelion. You know, the part where they ran out of time and money for the animation, and so they just started putting storyboards on the screen. The other example was Final Fantasy VIII. According to developer interviews, FF8's story was built around two central ideas. First, Square wanted to tell two parallel stories unfolding across different time periods. Second, they wanted to create what they described as the first video game love story. Both concepts survived into the finished game, but somewhere along the way, the narrative lost focus. To be honest, I'm still not entirely sure what FF8's story is even about, really. FF8 begins with the distinctly anime school days premise, following a group of students at Balam Garden, an elite military academy that trains seeds, mercenary soldiers tasked with combating immensely powerful sorceresses whose magic is passed down through generations. Squall and his classmates soon find themselves caught in a war against the Galbadian Empire, culminating in an assassination attempt against its new ruler, the sorceress Adea. It's a strong setup. The problem is that FF8 constantly introduces intriguing ideas without fully developing them. As I said, Disc 1 is nearly flawless when it comes to establishing the world, raising the stakes, and maintaining momentum. But the further the story progresses, the less cohesive it becomes. It's not that the story itself doesn't make sense, despite what its reputation may suggest. And no, I will not be discussing the popular Squall is dead fan theory. That theory is dumb and always has been. For the most part, every major plot development is easy to follow, and the characters' motivations remain understandable. It certainly helps that FF8's localization is actually competent this time around. It's a little bland in places, and its insistence on writing capital O lowercase k irrationally bothers me. But it's a massive step up from FF7's embarrassing typos and FF Tactics' incomprehensible script. Sorry to everyone who misses the old numbered spell names, but I'll gladly trade Fire 3 for Firaga if it means the dialogue actually reads naturally. Unlike many fans, I also really like Ultimisha's goal of compressing all of time and space into a single point so that she can rule everything forever. It's terrifyingly abstract. Presumably, such a world would lose all logic, structure, and perhaps even physical form altogether. The concept is meant to be impossible to comprehend. That's exactly what makes it unsettling. No, the real problems with FF8's story lie elsewhere. More than anything else, the story of this game definitely feels like the victim of a rushed development cycle. Plot threads and supporting characters often disappear as quickly as they're introduced. Rinoa's little resistance group, the White Seeds, Shumi Village, they all feel like pieces of much larger storylines that never fully materialize. Norg's uprising at Balam Garden has always been the most baffling part of the entire plot to me. It comes out of nowhere with no foreshadowing or build-up, and after his boss fight, Norg is never seen or mentioned again. Sorceress Adele has an incredible design and could have been a fascinating antagonist, yet she doesn't appear until well into Disc 3, and we learn almost nothing about her before she's defeated. The world building itself is interesting, but much of it is buried inside the tutorial menu's lore logs, almost as if the game assumes that every player will read all of those. At one point during Disc 3, an NPC speaks of the Lunar Cry. As I'm sure you know, they say to Squall, monsters occasionally fall from the moon. Actually, no, I didn't know that because this is the first time it's ever been brought up. Other important lore barely appears in the main story at all. Hein, the mythical, almost religious figure responsible for creating the sorceresses, is completely absent despite sorceresses driving the entire plot. Now, normally I don't mind RPGs using optional lore logs to expand on their backstory. FF Tactics and FF12 both do this very well. The problem is when those optional entries start feeling like required reading just to understand the main narrative. And because RPG stories are so closely intertwined with their gameplay, that unfinished feeling spreads throughout the rest of the experience. One of FF8's defining ideas is alternating between Squall's story and Laguna's. In theory, it's a fantastic premise. In practice, though, the Laguna sequences are so widely separated in time that they lose any real sense of progression. As a result, FF8 feels less like what the developers intended, in that you're following two parallel storylines, and instead, more like you're following one story that's repeatedly being interrupted by extended non-sequiturs. And I don't think anything illustrates FF8's unfinished nature better than its world map. Traditionally, receiving the airship marks the moment a Final Fantasy game truly opens up, but here, once you acquire the Ragnarok, there's surprisingly little left to discover. A handful of optional locations, the Chocobo Forests, Odin, but nowhere near the amount of exploration that some earlier Final Fantasies encouraged. Thanks to enemies scaling to your level, exploration is never punished. There's just not much of it. In short, what I'm saying is that this world ends up feeling surprisingly barren. There are only around half a dozen major cities, noticeably fewer than previous entries. I mean, come on, 7 or 8 cities is like Final Fantasy I numbers. The southern continent of Centra is especially disappointing. In-universe, it's mostly uninhabitable after being devastated by the Lunar Cry a century earlier, which is a perfectly reasonable explanation. But despite all the mystery surrounding it, it plays almost no role in the larger story, and most of its locations are optional, leaving an entire continent of the game feeling almost completely irrelevant. Even the optional content feels lighter than previous games. Omega Weapon, for instance, is an excellent super boss, but it's also the only one in the game. No, Ultima Weapon does not count, which feels underwhelming after FF5, 6, and 7 all featured multiple endgame challenges. The rush development becomes even more obvious in the dungeon design. With relatively few locations to visit, the story instead repeatedly sends you back to the same places over and over. There are only about 5 or 6 proper dungeons, and many of them rely heavily on repeated assets. The Tomb of the Unknown King and Delling City's sewers reuse the same handful of rooms over and over. The Galbadian prison is the worst offender, repeating the same circular floor 13 times. And because you begin in the middle, you effectively have to climb the entire thing twice. The Deep Sea Research Center follows a similarly repetitive vertical layout, though at least this one is optional and each floor is mercifully brief. Ironically, the game's 2 best dungeons are Lunatic Pandora and Ultimicia's Castle, which don't arrive until the very end, making them feel like too little too late. FF8 also inherits one of my biggest criticisms of FF7, and arguably makes it worse. Because Guardian Forces and Junctions, not the characters themselves, are what define your builds, your actual party members barely matter outside of their limit breaks. The game practically admits this too through the Junction Exchange feature, which lets you instantly transfer an entire build from one character to another wholesale. No questions asked, no caveats, no downside, it's just plop. The leveling system only compounds the issue somehow. Squall is mandatory for much of the game, and because every level requires a flat 1000 EXP instead of being on a curve, he will naturally outlevel everyone else, no matter what you do. By the end of my playthrough, Squall had reached level 100 while his teammates hadn't even broken level 50, creating this bizarre situation where all the enemies were simultaneously underleveled for Squall and overleveled for everyone else. Honestly, I think Final Fantasy VIII is the entry that could benefit the most from an FF7 style remake. People are always saying they want to see 6 or 9 remade next, but like, guys, 8 is right there. I for one would love to see Square given the chance to properly flesh out all of these abandoned or underdeveloped ideas. I don't even care if it takes them 12 years to make it. Just stop remaking games that are already great. Start remaking games that could be made great with just a little bit of reworking. FF8 is a conflicting experience for me. It lays the groundwork for a genuinely compelling story, but several plot threads feel like they were abandoned before they had a chance to pay off. Unlike many of the game's detractors, though, I don't actually think the plot is all that confusing. Undercooked, absolutely, but nowhere near as incomprehensible as some people claim. There is, however, one enormous exception, and if you've played FF8, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. The reveal that nearly the entire party grew up together in the same orphanage is the one moment where FF8's storytelling truly felt contrived. Like, I was rolling my eyes. This was so ridiculous. Amnesia has long been one of JRPG's most overused tropes, and even by 1999 it was already well worn. But revealing that every party member grew up together and all happened to forget that exact same period of their lives feels so absurd that in almost any other game I would assume this was parody. The game tries to justify this by explaining that Guardian Forces are said to cause memory loss, a detail that prior to this moment is hinted at exactly once in an optional lore entry. But even if you accepted that explanation, it's hard to see what this twist actually adds to the story. On paper, it accomplishes 2 things. First, it establishes that this party of characters shares a much deeper bond than we realized, which I guess works well enough. Secondly, it reveals that GFs gradually erase your memories. But unfortunately, the story can't actually do anything with that revelation. GFs are the foundation of the game's gameplay, so the story cannot meaningfully explore those consequences without asking the player to stop engaging with its central gameplay system. So the story raises a bunch of new implications and then immediately ignores them because the game's mechanics demand that it does. Oh no, GFs cause memory loss. Oh well, let's keep using them.
What shall we do, Captain Hook? Nothing!
To me, it feels like the writers wanted 2 incompatible ideas at once. They wanted players to meet the cast alongside Squall as the story progresses, but they also wanted those characters to have years of shared history before the story even began. Their solution was simply making everyone childhood friends who all conveniently forgot that they were childhood friends. Even many of FF8's biggest defenders struggle to justify this twist, and for me, it's easily the single biggest blemish on this game's entire narrative. The cast also left me surprisingly cold, and again, I suspect that's a consequence of the game's rush development. Nobody ever feels completely fleshed out. By the end of the game, Selphie was the only party member I found consistently endearing. Not because she's especially complex or anything, but just because she's naturally likable. Zell is perfectly fine. I'm completely indifferent to Irvine. Quistis initially seemed like one of the more interesting party members, but then the game kind of just stops her character arc after the first 2 hours. Ironically though, the characters I connected the least with were the two leads. Squall feels like Cloud as imagined by someone who's never actually played FF7. He's aloof, emotionally distant, and competent, but lacking the internal conflict that made Cloud so compelling. Squall's arc, learning to open himself up to others, works conceptually, but he spends so much of the game emotionally shut off that I never became especially invested in him. Renoa, meanwhile, swings to the opposite extreme. She's a privileged rich girl with daddy issues who's prone to childish outbursts the moment things stop going her way. Honestly, despite the game pushing her and Squall as the primary couple, Renoa feels like a much better match for her ex-boyfriend, Cypher, who is equally immature and used to getting whatever he wants. But I suppose that's kind of the point. Their relationship gradually forces both of them to grow. Squall learns to express himself emotionally, while Renoa slowly realizes that the world doesn't revolve around her. Because of that, I actually think the romance works. I never felt like the Squall and Renoa relationship was forced, despite how often I've seen that criticism repeated. More importantly, I love the symbolism behind it. Squall is the son of Laguna, while Renoa is the daughter of Julia, two people who clearly loved one another but through circumstance were never actually able to be together. And the game never turns this into some dramatic reveal either. Squall never discovers that Laguna is his father, and Renoa's relation to Julia is tucked away in the lore menu. This is all left for the player to piece together, through scattered conversations and narrative clues. The idea that Laguna and Julia's children eventually find one another transforms FF8 into a story about destiny, about a love so powerful that it literally spanned generations. Placing a love story at the emotional center of a video game was also pretty ambitious for 1999. Earlier Final Fantasy games certainly featured romance as a side plot, 4, 6, and 7 all did to varying degrees, but 8 was the first where the love story became the backbone of the entire experience. It represented another step in video games' ongoing push toward more sophisticated storytelling, something the industry was deeply fascinated by at the time. And this is also one of the more believable depictions of teenage romance that I've seen. These characters are irrational, dramatic, and overly emotional because they're teenagers. What could have easily become melodramatic instead feels sincere. Even if, call me cynical, I still finished the game thinking, $10 as they break up freshman year of college. Where FF8 never stumbles, though, is its presentation. Visually, it is leaps and bounds ahead of FF7. The FMVs and pre-rendered environments are gorgeous, and for the first time, the series features realistically proportioned character models that remain visually consistent throughout the entire game. Sakaguchi once described earlier Final Fantasy stories as almost a form of puppetry, with exaggerated proportions serving practical limitations. But FF8 aimed for a more intimate, character-driven drama, and that meant creating characters who actually looked grounded and believable. Earlier FF games used separate field and battle models, with tiny overworld characters transforming into larger, more detailed versions during combat. FF6 had already eliminated that distinction through sprite work, but it still embraced the classic super deformed RPG aesthetic. FF8 finally unified everything. The characters remain proportionally consistent across exploration, battles, and FMVs. No more bobbleheads, no more little map puppets. Party members finally follow behind you instead of magically disappearing into squall after every cutscene. Every animation, from combat to cinematics, was motion captured by live actors to make movements feel as natural as the PlayStation hardware would allow. For perhaps the first time, Final Fantasy looked less like an anime and more like something approaching live action. Even the understated gray dialogue boxes, while not my favorite aesthetic choice, still clearly support the game's more grounded visual direction. The music is equally phenomenal. Granted, that's hardly surprising, considering Nobuo Uematsu has seemingly been incapable of missing for the last 40 years. One distinction from previous FF soundtracks is that Uematsu decided to forego individual character themes, instead building FF8's soundtrack around a handful of recurring musical motifs. Liberi Fatali, which accompanies the game's breathtaking opening FMV, repeatedly resurfaces throughout major battles and story moments, tying the entire adventure together. Then there's Eyes on Me, the first fully vocal main theme in the franchise. Performed by Chinese pop singer Fei Wong, Eyes on Me is a love ballad representing the game's two generational romances. It's diegetic too. Within the game's world, Julia herself writes the song as a love letter to Laguna, a bittersweet lament about their lost romance. The melody quietly and repeatedly appears throughout the game long before the player ever hears its lyrics, finally paying off near the end of Disc 3 in one of the only scenes where I found myself genuinely invested in Squall and Rinoa as individuals rather than simply as a couple. By the ending credits, the song has evolved into the musical embodiment of both romances simultaneously, forever connecting both generations of the story through music. It was also a massive commercial success, spending 19 consecutive weeks atop Japanese music charts and remaining the best-selling video game vocal single until Utada Hikaru's Simple and Clean eventually overtook it. Final Fantasy would try to recreate that success with future songs, most notably those in FF9 and 10, but none of them ever quite matched the mainstream cultural impact of Eyes on Me. It remains one of the franchise's defining songs, and one of the most successful pieces of video game music ever recorded. And that's not all. Man, every last battle theme in this game is incredible. Don't Be Afraid, Force Your Way, The Man with the Machine Gun, Premonition, Maybe I'm a Lion, they're all fantastic. And real ones know the Extreme absolutely clears One Winged Angel. Outside of an overworld theme that I'm not especially fond of, and probably my least favorite rendition of the Chocobo theme, I genuinely don't think that there's a bad track anywhere in this game. In short, FF8 was the most graphically impressive Final Fantasy game at the time of its release, by a wide margin. And its soundtrack is one of the most impressive of the franchise, period. Regardless of how you may feel about the story and gameplay, there's no denying that FF8 is one of the most aesthetically stunning projects the franchise has ever produced. While critical reception to FF8 was glowing, it was far more polarizing among fans. Final Fantasy VIII, for better or worse, was a very different game from Final Fantasy VII. That wasn't unusual for the series. Reinvention had always been Final Fantasy's identity, but FF7's unprecedented mainstream success brought millions of new players into the genre, many of whom had never played an RPG before, let alone another Final Fantasy game. Those players understandably expected more FF7. Instead, they got junctioning, enemies scaling to their level, and magic as a consumable resource. There was no materia, no cloud, no familiar formula. Why was Square trying to fix what wasn't broken? What fascinates me is that FF7 created all these massive expectations which FF8 then deliberately ignored, and I really respect Square for sticking to their guns here. After creating one of the biggest games in the world, the easiest decision would have been to just make Final Fantasy VII 2. Instead, they did what Final Fantasy has always done. They reinvented everything. That's why all this negative discourse I keep seeing with each new Final Fantasy game is so tiring to me. This mindset of, this doesn't feel like Final Fantasy anymore, or this franchise was better when it was just this one specific thing. But Final Fantasy has never just been one specific thing, not really. Right from its very first sequel, this franchise made it clear how very different these games could be. FF2 reinvented the series, and then FF3 reinvented it again. FF4 did it, 5 did it, and 6 did it. Final Fantasy VII certainly did it, and then FF8 may have been the boldest reinvention yet. That's why, in spite of all the issues I've brought up, I think I've finally come to appreciate Final Fantasy VIII, warts and all. Every Final Fantasy game is unique in its own way, and even so, 8 still somehow feels like the rebellious teenager of the series. Looking back on it now, I think more highly of FF8 than I ever have before. Not because I've stopped seeing its flaws, but because I've come to appreciate just how fearless it was. At a time when Square sat comfortably at the top of the industry with everything to lose, they still chose to take an enormous creative gamble instead of just repeating themselves, and they delivered something that nobody had seen coming. Final Fantasy VIII's greatest strength and greatest weakness are ultimately the same thing: its refusal to be anything other than itself. I don't think Final Fantasy VIII succeeds at everything it tries, but I would much rather play a game that stumbles while chasing new ideas than a game that's content repeating old ones. That's why nearly 30 years later, we're still arguing about Final Fantasy VIII. Love it or hate it, people still have something to say about it. Somehow, I think Final Fantasy VIII is the title that most exemplifies the very spirit of what Final Fantasy is. It's whatever the hell it wants to be.